So I'll start and tell you guys a little bit more about me. I'm currently an entrepreneur in residence at Silicon Valley Bank. SVB is a bank for startups. They actually have an operation in Europe, but I work in our US office primarily with accelerators and early stage startup founders. And I started my career actually not as an entrepreneur. I was a public school teacher in Baltimore, Maryland, and got very interested in technology, well, in education technology while I was teaching, and ended up moving to the Valley to become a VC. So I was working for an education technology venture fund and thought that I wanted to have a career in ed tech. And about 6 months in, things changed when three friends and I started MoveLoot. So for 3.5 years, I was the co-founder and COO of a company called MoveLoot, which I'm going to tell you guys more about today. This is me and my co-founders at the very beginning of building our company. But MoveLoot was born out of this idea that we basically thought there was a lot of pain involved with having to sell any furniture that you had, particularly when you moved. So all of us had moved across the country. We all lived on the East Coast, and we were moving to the West Coast, and we had beds and sofas and kitchen tables, and we didn't really have a good way to get rid of that stuff. In my case, I had a bunch of furniture in my house in Baltimore. I sold most of it on Craigslist, but it took 6 weeks, and I had all these random strangers coming through my house, and it was a really horrible experience. So we thought, what if somebody could create an experience that was better? So this is just an overview of kind of the options for people who are getting rid of furniture or buying furniture. In the US, at least, you can try to donate it. A lot of people, when they're moving out of an apartment, will leave furniture on the curb, and somebody might come pick it up, or the dump takes it. Or they try to sell it on a third-party site like Craigslist. And then when it comes to buying furniture, if you don't want to spend a ton of money, you either go to IKEA, or you go to a thrift store, or you do the reverse of what I just talked about, and you try to buy furniture from individuals who are selling it. So this is what we created. We created MoveLoot, which we thought was a fundamentally better experience because we took all of the pain out of the actual selling and moving process. So the way it would work was that you would have an app on your phone. You would take a photo of the item that you wanted to sell and submit it to us. We would price it for you and let you pick a time for us to come pick it up from you. And then we would send one of our movers to your house. We'd pick up the furniture and take it back to our warehouse where we photographed it and then listed it on our site for sale. And then once it was purchased, we would then deliver it to the buyer that purchased it and give you a percentage of the sale. So the beginning. MoveLoot launched in the fall of 2013. And originally, we had no money. We were 4 24-year-olds who had worked for 2 years after college and really had no capital to be able to support this business. So we raised about $15,000 from friends and family on an Indiegogo campaign. And that $15,000 let us get our first warehouse space. And we needed a warehouse space because we needed a place to store the furniture once we picked it up from your house and before it sold to the buyer. So $15,000 got us 1,400 square feet, which this is a photo of our first warehouse space packed with furniture. 1,400 square feet is not very big, and we filled the space pretty quickly. We also did all of the pickup and delivery ourselves. So we were the movers. We rented a truck. We drove around San Francisco. I'm not a mover. I was like carrying couches down 10 flights of stairs. It was horrible, but it was a great experience because I learned how difficult the process is, and I think understood how painful it was in a different way. So we got some initial traction, but again, we only had $15,000, and we were spending $2,000 a month on rent and $1,000 a month to rent a truck, and we were very quickly going to run out of cash. So we needed to figure out what to do, and we were still pretty new to the tech entrepreneur thing, but a friend of ours told us about Y Combinator, which at the time we assumed was kind of a pure tech accelerator. We had a business where we're building software to try to make these processes more efficient. We had a website, but we didn't necessarily think we would qualify for YC. But on a whim, we applied and sure enough, 6 weeks later we got in, which was very lucky because we definitely could not have afforded to keep running our business without the investment we got originally from Y Combinator. So YC was a really important point for us, I would say, because it helped us really focus on getting 10% week over week growth. And I think when we started MoveLoot, we had all these big ideas about what we wanted to do, but there wasn't a lot of focus. We wanted to try a lot of things, but we weren't really deliberate about how we wanted to go about it. And I think YC was really great for helping us become more deliberate about the growth that we wanted to see. So by the end of Y Combinator, we were in 9 storage units in that shared warehouse space. So I showed you that picture of the 1,400 square feet. We had 9 more spaces like that in this building. It was horribly inefficient because some of the spaces were on the 2nd floor, some were like at the back of this warehouse, and there was 1 loading dock. So we were having to put stuff in the elevator or carry it downstairs, and stuff was not tagged well. It was just all around a disaster. And so we basically tried to figure out what to do, because this facility that we were in was also out of space, and they could not let us keep expanding into all of their storage units. So about 2 weeks before Y Combinator closed, we raised a $2.8 million seed round. And this was largely to get us more warehouse space in San Francisco. So this was our first San Francisco warehouse. This is one half of it. There was another space that mirrors the space that you're seeing here. And basically, what this warehouse space allowed us to do was to really start to build systems and processes and use the technology that we were building to become more efficient with how we wanted to store furniture, how we wanted to route trucks, things of that nature. Also, when you raise money, as it turns out, then there are a lot of other people who are involved in helping you run your business. And when we started to raise money, we raised from some really amazing investors who were very bullish on growth. A lot of them had invested in companies that, like Uber or Lyft, that had seen kind of these crazy growth curves and that had prioritized growth over becoming profitable. And that was the advice that we were also given, which was, you can figure it out. Like basically, I guess build the plane while you're flying it, which is a little bit difficult to do, especially when you have a business that has furniture that is big and bulky and you have to move it around. So growth. With that $2.8 million seed round, we were in San Francisco. We also launched another market in North Carolina, and we were really starting to grow out of control. People couldn't get appointments on our website for multiple weeks. As you can see here, this was probably 4 or 5 months after we moved in, but we had to rack the whole warehouse and then re-rack it. This was about 30,000 square feet of space, so a lot of space, and we very quickly ate up quite a bit of the space. And the growth was really great, but it also meant that some other things happened. We also grew our team, so this is a picture of the beginning of growing our team, and we started to launch more markets. We launched in 5 more cities over the course of the next year and a half, and we raised another, a $9 million Series A and an $11 million Series A1 to be able to support all of these operations. And while all this growth was really exciting, it also came at a pretty high cost to our business. And the other piece of this is that I mentioned before that the way our model worked was that we would take the sofa and then hold on to it in our warehouse. And I showed you the warehouse space. But the problem then became that we were running out of space in the cities where we had warehouses, and the space was incredibly expensive. So we needed to come up with a way to be able to store more stuff and do it in a cost-efficient way. So that's when we came up with this new idea for how to store our furniture that we called Hubandspoke. So this was a model that I had studied, that I'd seen a number of e-commerce and logistics companies use. And I thought this might be a good way for us to be able to expand and also to be able to share inventory between markets, because up until that point, if you were in San Francisco, the only inventory you were seeing was San Francisco inventory, which meant the selection could be somewhat limited. So basically the way Hubandspoke would work is that you'd have a big warehouse facility. For example, we had 150,000 square feet in Fresno, California. And that warehouse was the central storage facility for all of the furniture we were picking up in LA and in San Francisco. And we had our own fleet of drivers in LA and San Francisco that would come back to a small delivery dock where they would package up the furniture, and a big freight truck would come, take all the furniture from those markets, and then bring it to Fresno where we processed it and listed on the site. And then the reverse would happen as well. So when people purchased furniture in either of those markets, our Fresno team would then wrap up all the furniture, put it on a freight truck, and send it back to the market where it was going to be delivered. So this is eventually what our system looked like. We had Fresno that was serving San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then we had Raleigh, North Carolina, which basically allowed us to share inventory along the East Coast with New York, Charlotte, and Atlanta. I mentioned that obviously this cost a lot of money. By the fall of 2015, we had over 200 employees, and we were burning a lot of cash, well over $1 million a month. This was largely due in part to the focus we had on growth over profitability, which was something that we had talked with our investors about and had agreed that that was the plan until the funding environment started to change. And once the funding environment changed, we had to basically figure out what to do. And that meant focusing on profitability, really understanding what our costs were and our unit economics. But it also meant we had to lay off people on our team, and we had to get better about using software to scale some of our processes. So around the same time that we began focusing on profitability, we saw a dip in revenue because we were now scaling back the hours that we were operating, so we didn't have the revenue that we had when we were basically subsidizing our growth with VC funding. So because we were not growing as quickly as we had been when we were in this growth-focused phase, we basically needed to figure out, while we were on the path to becoming profitable, how do we continue to grow in a way that is sustainable for the business. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do. We did not have the money to go launch new markets, so I couldn't go to Chicago and say, MoveLoot is now in Chicago and spend a lot of money, because it would have really hurt our path to profitability. So we developed the idea for a peer-to-peer platform, which is basically like a prettier version of Craigslist. So the way it would work was that you would hold the sofa in your home and take a picture of it, and we would white out the background for you, and then when it's sold, we would send a third-party delivery driver, not one of our delivery drivers, but somebody else that we could contract with, and we'd send that person to your home to pick it up, and then they would coordinate with the buyer. The problem with that experience, or what we were worried about, was actually the customer experience. So part of what was so great about what we had built was that we had trained our team in how to interact with customers and deliver a really high-quality experience. And now the experience was going to be totally different. Nevertheless, after a lot of debate and a lot of user research, we decided to take that plunge, hoping that this pivot would actually get us to the revenue number we felt we needed to be at to raise another round of funding. However, that's not what happened. So as you can see from this graph, this is we were trudging along with about $600,000 a month in revenue, and we really thought that pivoting the business was going to get us to about $1 million a month. Because now we would be everywhere in the United States. You didn't just have to be in a market where we were, and for sure, we would get there. What actually happened is that when we launched Peertopeer, our revenue totally tanked. So within 3 weeks, our revenue, once we launched the product, in the first month we did about $150,000. And in the second month, I think maybe by June we were doing $175,000. But needless to say, we were still burning a lot of cash, and we now did not have the revenue that we once did. I also mentioned the burn rate piece of this because I mentioned that we had our own trucks and warehouses and our own team. By the time that we launched Peertopeer, we had scaled back those operations pretty significantly, so we didn't have as many team members as we once did. But we did have all these assets. We were leasing warehouses all over the country, and we were leasing trucks. And so we were still spending monthly for assets that we weren't using. And that really contributed to our to pushing up our burn rate. And we tried to negotiate out of a lot of these leases. So in the beginning, when we first signed them, I had negotiated a lot of short-term leases for fear that something like this might happen. And even then, it's still very difficult to find subletters. You have to, industrial leasing in the United States is a very, very interesting world to operate in. So what do? We ultimately decided to shut down, but it's a very anticlimactic ending. But basically, what happened was we had a meeting with our investors to try to figure out the plan. Our investors felt, I think also, as we also felt, somewhat responsible, and that we had made this decision together. And we all really believed in the product, and we believed in what we were doing. And to our investors' credit, they tried to raise an internal round. So we didn't really have enough time to go to external investors, but they tried to get all of the current investors to put more money in. So we only raised about $3 million, and we looked at where that was going to get us. It was only going to get us enough runway for about 6 months, and we thought we were going to have to come back and ask for more money. So after kind of a lot of long discussions, we ultimately decided to try to sell the business. However, we also took something called venture debt, which you might be familiar with. So venture debt is funding that you take along with the equity fundraise that you do that is from a bank or from a venture debt fund, and it's usually for a specific purpose. In our case, we used venture debt to help finance a lot of warehousing. And because we had used venture debt, we then owed money to these creditors, and they're secured lenders, which basically means if anything happens to the business, they get paid back first. So when we decided to try to sell the business, we had to let them know that we were going to try to sell the business. And they were very nice to us and said, okay, well, let's work together and figure out how we can do this. But ultimately, what happens is when you foreclose to a debt lender, you default on all of your leases. So when we went out to try to sell the business, a lot of people were really interested in buying the company, but they were interested in buying the company that had trucks and warehouses. And now we were only a company that had logistics and routing and inventory management software and a big user list and a brand. But the assets were totally gone. So ultimately, we weren't able to sell the company for that reason, and we were able to negotiate to be able to fulfill all the remaining orders, and then eventually we shut down the company and laid off the remainder of our team. So the picture on the left is of the last day that we were in our office. Our office was on Market Street in San Francisco, and I think a liquidator was going to come and take all the rest of the furniture, but it was kind of sad. I took a picture as I was walking out the door just so I could remember our office. Okay, so in conclusion, and I want to get to any questions you guys might have, but there's a lot of things that I feel like I've reflected on and learned from this experience now, I guess, almost a year and a half later. But one of the biggest things, which is kind of a no-brainer, is that even tech-driven businesses with physical products, I should back up. Costs are a big component of businesses with physical products, and that doesn't necessarily always align with investor expectations when it comes to growth. So I think that there is an assumption out there that if you're a tech-driven business and you have a physical product, that the tech piece of your business is what's going to get you the growth that you need to see. I think the reality is it's actually a lot harder to do. I think tech can get you a lot of the way there, but until we have robotics and other types of technology that can replace labor or do other functions in a warehouse type setting, it's going to be a lot more difficult. The other thing, which I didn't totally touch on early on, was that I really wish one of the things we had done was brought in more experts. So I mentioned that I was pretty young when I started MoveLoot, as were my co-founders. I had no experience in supply chain management, which was fine, but I read a lot and tried to learn as much as I could. But at the end of the day, there are people out there who know a lot of stuff and who would have cut the time to get to an answer or decision by a lot, instead of just relying on me to figure out the answer. So I really wish that we had hired more experienced people. We did hire some supply chain professionals, but I think we did it too late. And at that point, it made it harder to rebuild the systems and processes internally that we needed. And then the last thing I'll say is just trust your instincts when it comes to growth. So what I mean by that is, I think as an entrepreneur, once you take outside capital, you're gonna feel a lot of external pressure to grow and to grow really fast, because your investors wanna see a return. You wanna see a return, maybe you want to get acquired or you want to IPO. But at the end of the day, when you have physical goods that are tricky to move around, and you have labor and people and a large team, like things just don't happen as quickly. And while you can still grow fast, you might not always feel like the growth makes sense for your business. And if you ever feel that way, you should speak up about it and not grow as quickly. I think one of my biggest regrets with MoveLoot was that at times when we were pushing growth, when I wasn't totally comfortable with the pace at which we were growing, I didn't speak up because I felt like that was the plan and that was what we had agreed to, and we owed people money, and that was kind of the path that we needed to be on. So that is the story of MoveLoot. But I'd love to answer any questions you guys have, and happy to share more about my experience.
So what, and I know you would have speak up, but what would you have done differently to actually balance more the operational, like advancement and the growth, so it's actually not exploding?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I would have done differently, I guess physically, is just not grown as fast. So I wish that we had spent time in San Francisco really focused on understanding our systems and processes, what was going to happen when we hit X amount of inventory and we were doing X amount in sales, and what did that physically look like for our operation. I don't think we had a good understanding of all of those systems before we started expanding. And so I really wish we'd just spent time focusing on that. And then I think the way that I would have grown in retrospect is I may have actually launched the peer-to-peer platform I mentioned in tandem with what we were doing, and used that as the lever for indicating when to expand. So once we had a lot of inventory in Chicago, we would then launch a physical operation in Chicago because we'd have the revenue to support it.
I would just follow up on your question, I guess. So when you launched the peer-to-peer marketplace, you had completely already shut down the
physical operation.
But you were still still had
paying.
the leases on them. Okay. That was a short question.
Okay, perfect. Question. So since you were operating in 6 markets,
Yeah.
and then you kind of just changed your business model. Well, maybe not just fully in a snap, but eventually. But did you run any tests before, like a little A/B testing to see, okay, in this market to see, because you're not only changing the physical part of it, but also the emotional aspect of your business model,
Yeah.
And did you do any of that prior test?
We
So
did.
Can you talk more about that?
Of course. So we did. I actually spent about 2.5 months before we launched peer-to-peer doing a lot of user research. So I did focus groups. I worked with our designer to try to basically do customer interviews to try to understand how this move was going to change who our customer was, how we marketed to them. And I came back with a list of suggestions. A lot of them were very brand and market focused. As you can see, our branding was kind of fun and funky, and it was very geared towards people in big cities. When we launched that peer-to-peer marketplace, our customer was a different customer. It was somebody who was willing to hold on to their sofa because they didn't have, they didn't have to be out to move to another city or to move to another apartment in a city. And so our branding needed to be more focused towards largely women, but people in their, late 30s to mid 50s, basically. And we knew all of this before we launched it, and I think perhaps incorrectly assumed that we would get to it after the launch. So instead of making those changes all at once, we thought, let's just actually get the product out, ship the product, and then worry about the marketing and the branding later. Unfortunately, that strategy did not work because we just didn't have enough time to actually be able to see it through.
I want to pick up on something you said during your talk about the pressure you felt from the investors to pursue that growth. And first, I want to observe something that is probably useful for everybody in this audience, and it's a difference between investment in the US versus what occurs here. In the US, investors are much more interested in that very high levels of growth and are willing to take the risk of failure, which is not the kind of risk that you as the founder want.
Right.
But in order to get that investment, that's often the case. You have to accept that. And so I know you put the choice that you would have preferred to slow down in terms of the physical product, but I actually wonder how much of that pressure was what drove you to go that path anyway, even if it wasn't the physical side. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. We did feel an enormous amount of pressure from our investors to grow, but we also felt that pressure knowing that when you take VC funding, there's an expectation that they're going to get a 10x return on their investment or zero. And so for them, they're basically giving everybody the same advice, right? Grow, 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 grow. And one company has to be Uber. And in your case, this is your baby. This is everything for you. And if your company is an Uber, but it's a $200 million company, that can still be successful for you, but an investor might not see that as a big success. Or they might. It just depends on the investor. But I think one of the things that we really struggled with as young founders was knowing when to push back. This was our first startup. We really felt we're not sure if we're comfortable with that, but these guys have been around for 30 or 40 years. They've seen multiple cycles. They invested in Uber. They must know way more than we do about how this works. I think the reality is we were close to our business and we understood our business and we knew what was going to work for our business, and we probably should have listened to that instinct.
Thanks a lot for your honest talk.
Yeah.
When you were first thinking up the company concept, did you also think about doing this peer-to-peer marketplace, or did that really come later as you realized that there's scaling issues with physical goods?
Yeah, it was a big debate. I, at the time, was roommates with one of my co-founders, and I remember sitting in the living room very early on before we launched a product, and we had this whiteboard, and we were writing down all the pros and cons of going peer-to-peer versus building this big kind of infrastructure-heavy model. And ultimately, for us, what it came down to was the pain point. We understood the pain point as, I just want someone to deal with this, which, and it was also when we did focus groups and when we talked to people, most people that we talked to, granted, they were in our demographic, also talked about wanting someone to just handle the process for them, and that, I think, ultimately was what drove us in that direction. It was also something that nobody else was doing. So there were tons of peer-to-peer marketplaces. At the time, I can recall there were 6 or 7 different ones that had launched, and none of them had the experience we thought that they should have, and we just generally didn't think that peer-to-peer was necessarily the right way to solve the problem. I'm still not convinced it's the right way to solve the problem. But I think from a scale perspective, it might have been a good way to scale in growth as opposed to spending a lot of money up front.
Thank you for for sharing your story.
Yeah.
I would like to hear more about your experience at Y Combinator. So could you tell us a bit more about how you got into the program and what it gave you?
Of course. So YC is, at the time that we applied to YC, Paul Graham, who is one of the founders of YC, was still running YC. So now there's a guy named Sam Altman who runs YC, and YC batches, so the numbers of companies that they accept has doubled. So there were only about 70 companies in our batch. Actually, Algolia was one of them. And basically, the way the process works is you fill out a paper application and have to be very specific about what your startup does and be very clear. They don't like you to use a lot of what they call marketing speak. So take out a lot of the frou-frou stuff and just be very clear about what your business is and does and who you guys are as founders. And then assuming that you make it past the written application process, they invite you to interview. The way the interview works is kind of absurd, but you basically are invited in for a 10-minute interview slot, and you sit in front of 4 or 5 YC partners, oftentimes YC alums or people who have had successful startups or actually failed startups. There are a lot of YC partners that have had startups that didn't work out, and then they became YC partners. And you basically, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions about your product. And what they're looking for in that interview largely is, how are you guys interacting as a founding team? So at that point, it's way less about the idea and way more about, like, do we think this is the group of people that can pull this off? And even if it isn't this idea, because there are a lot of YC founders who will apply to YC with one idea, and by the time they finish YC, it's a totally different idea. But do we think this group of people has what it takes to actually build this company? So our interview was about 10 minutes long, as they all are, and we were actually interviewed by Paul Graham and Jessica Livingston and the other two, and the other Paul and Trevor, who was the 4 original founders of YC, and Sam Altman. And I think we had mixed feelings about how the interview went. There was one point at which I think one of us talked over the other one, and it wasn't totally clear like what our answer was. But what I do remember is both Paul Graham and Jessica talking about how much they understood the pain point that we had talked about, and they talked about living in Boston and having to put their furniture on the curb, and they understood why we were taking that approach. So I think that ultimately helped us, and that's largely probably why we got in. We definitely didn't expect to get in, so I think it was a pleasant surprise, but actually being in Y Combinator was incredible for us. I think it gave us a lot of market validation that we wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise, especially as 4 non-Stanford entrepreneurs that were trying to prove themselves. YC, the way it works is it's a 12-week process where you're not required to be at YC every day working. Instead, they want you to spend most of the week building your product, and then on Tuesdays you go in for office hours where you meet with partners, and then there's a Tuesday night dinner where a founder or a CEO will come in and talk about their experience running or building a company. So we did that for 12 weeks, and for us it was an accountability function. So every week we were like going to meet with a partner, and we had to tell them, like, did we grow 10% or did we not? And if we didn't, why didn't we grow? And so we're constantly trying to figure out strategies to get us the growth that we needed, so that when we got to demo day, we had a story to tell investors about why they should invest in our product. So yeah, does that answer your question about YC? Cool.
Hey.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Cool. Shruti, thanks a lot for the confessions. Actually, the family, I think it would be really helpful to see this more often, like people who failed and who are telling about the mistakes. Because usually I see people who succeeded, and it's great. It's actually a great story every time. But you're like, as somebody who's about to start a company, I think you can learn a lot from people who actually made mistakes, or with VCs or the product or the pivot. So thanks a lot. I appreciate that. My question is, just as I mentioned, because I'm an entrepreneur and I'm about to raise money, still in the process, and for me, it's I don't know how it happens that you have investors who give you 3 million, 9 million, 11 million, and then you stand here and you say, I wish I onboarded people who actually helped me or gave me advice, or who had experience or more experience than you did, because you were young, obviously. And these investors gave you a ton of money and didn't give you the people to manage it properly, and went for growth in a business of warehouses, which we know is very, very tough. And so the risk of them losing all the money, of all the 20 whatever million, is so high. So I don't know how it happens. Maybe it's just in the US, by the way, I don't know, that they didn't care of losing 20 million. But how does it happen that you ended up without real advisors and real strategy, basically?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to say we didn't have any real advisors. There are definitely investors that we had that I deeply respect and that were very helpful. But you're right that we did not have a lot of people who understood supply chain and warehousing. It might just be a US thing. I think I actually think one of the trends that I guess I've observed, not that I've lived through too many boom and bust cycles, but I think what happens, at least in the Valley, is that investors get very excited, or they do really well with a group of like B2B SaaS ideas. And then they think, well, if this worked for a B2B company, like it's obviously going to work for a non-B2B company. And then they hit like an Uber, which is not really a B2B company. It's a consumer product. And I think that ups their confidence level in other types of companies working. And so then they start to invest in other companies. Like in our case, within, I guess, a year of us, they were investing in Instacart, and there was Nasty Gal, and there was a company called Good Eggs that did organic food delivery. Like there's a long list of these types of startups that I think basically raised money as a result of increased investor confidence in the power of venture capital to be able to build or to be able to scale businesses with more operating costs and physical products. And I actually don't think that that's like necessarily always going to be the wrong thesis, but I think we've seen it multiple times. Like in the 90s, there was a company called Webvan, which totally went bust. And I think that was also probably a direct result of like increased investor confidence. Like technology can solve this, so it can definitely solve this. And I think that like maybe one day there will be a world where a business like this is viable with venture capital funding. That world might have to include robotics, and it might have to include a lot more technology than what currently exists today. But I don't think we're there yet, is my answer.
Hi, my first question is, what was your marketing, especially, considering that people are used to traditional sites like Craigslist or eBay? And my second question is, do you think Loot would have better chances in Germany, a smaller country with also big cities, but with much smaller distances between them, or Europe in general?
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible. I think you would have a different set of challenges. For us, like even in San Francisco, we had challenges like getting a box truck up a very narrow street in San Francisco can be a challenge. But I definitely think it could work in a different market. As far as marketing goes, we had some very traditional marketing strategies, and then we used some tech marketing. So we had digital ads, Facebook and Google, but we also actually ran bus ads in San Francisco and New York, and we had BART ads, so like on the subway. We did radio ads in a couple of markets that were really successful and helped drive traffic to our site. In LA, we had billboards. Everybody in LA sits in traffic all the time, so that was also a really great way for us to grow our business. One of the best ways, actually, that we were eventually able to grow our business was through influencer marketing. So we found bloggers, mostly like home design bloggers, who we'd work with to be able to review the experience on their blog, and that often would translate into people that read their blog coming to our website to purchase furniture. And I think that was probably one of the most successful, that and PR. We were very fortunate to get a ton of press, so we were on CNBC and CNN and like Forbes and Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and so that was also really helpful in getting traffic to our site and at least building brand awareness so people knew about us.
I'd like to ask a question that rarely gets asked, so feel free to not answer it. But I think it is helpful for people who are setting out to be a founder or interested in that, and I think it often holds people back. As a founder of a business, you have your own lifestyle you need to take care of, and certainly in a place like San Francisco, that is a significant burden. You raised, I think it was 15K, 120K, 2.2, 9, and 11. At which point in that process did you feel, as founders, it was okay to start self-remunerating, and at what ratio, and at what point did you decide to stop doing that when your business was changing direction?
Of course. So actually, when we raised funding from Y Combinator, they told us we had to pay ourselves. So we were going to take no salary, and they said part of the money that we're giving you is for you to be able to basically like eat and survive. So that's when we started paying ourselves, but it was minimum wage. It was not very much money. When we raised our seed round, I think we maybe paid ourselves $50,000 a year, and that's the way it stayed until we raised either our A or our A1. at which point I think then we were making $70,000 a year. But once we started laying people off, we all took big salary cuts. Bill, one of my co-founders, who was the CEO, he went without a salary totally, and his partner supported him. But the rest of us kind of just scaled back what we earned from the business, and then didn't really ever build it back up because we wanted to put as much money into the business as possible. But that doesn't always make sense for people. Like, I think in our case, we were all really young. We don't have kids or mortgages or responsibilities, and we could take that kind of financial risk. I don't think that that is the case for everybody. It definitely isn't the case for everybody. It's definitely not an expectation, but it was something that we felt strongly about as we were building our business. Yeah.
This goes back to the YC thing. Okay, so before when you guys were just applying, you're saying like every week they want 10% growth. When you're applying though, like, and you've raised $15,000 from Kickstarter, right? And now this money's gone. Like, what are your, like, I guess metrics look like there? Do you have like, how many people are going to your site like a day as you're applying to Y Combinator? Is it like 5 people, or are you having like thousands of people, or, that's kind of my question.
Yeah, I mean, so it's going to vary from company to company. Yeah. There are YC companies that apply to YC with a lot of traction. There was one in our batch, a company called Mimi Box that is a Korean makeup company, that had already raised a substantial amount of money. And their traction looked very different. But what YC does is they tell you to pick a metric. In our case, we chose revenue because that was an easy thing for us to track towards.
Okay.
And we just needed to see 10% week over week growth in revenue. Okay. So we would spend all of our time focused on like really trying to get as much inventory in the door as possible so that we could try to sell as much as possible. Okay. And users was something we'd started to track with Google Analytics, but it was definitely not what we necessarily were evaluated against, I guess you could say, because at the end of the day, we wanted to be able to show like an up and to the right graph with a revenue number. But it often depends on the type of business. There are people that are in YC who have B2B startups or SaaS companies that don't have any revenue, and they get up at demo day and they say, I have 30 commitments from these companies to buy my product once I launch it. So different stages.
Sorry, one more quick question. You talked a lot about driving more inventory, and obviously that's a huge cost center was a huge cost center for your business. How did you scale the buyer side of the market? And it sounds like maybe you had some success with influencer marketing, but I mean, in general, it looks like you had very full warehouses, which is fantastic. So you had a lot of supply, but how did you really push the demand?
Totally. So interestingly enough, we did have very full warehouses. We actually had an 85% sell-through rate. So we were selling everything within 60 days, but that's still 60 days that you're sitting on that inventory. So that is also a cost. On the buy side, I mean, we did a lot of things. I actually think we probably relied too heavily on promotions. So we would send out email marketing campaigns and tell people, like, get a 10% discount, because often the 10% discount was coming out of our share. So I think we wish we had done less of that, but that honestly did drive a lot of revenue for us. Email marketing in general actually was really helpful for us because people liked the idea of, we'd send out an email and say, there are 100 new chairs on our website, and then people would click through and want to buy that stuff. But a lot of it was kind of trying to figure out scrappy strategies to get people to actually purchase. And we also started to figure out if there are ways to we started looking at click-through rates on certain types of products, and we're able to change where products sat in on the website, and that affected kind of the sell-through of certain products. And then in some cases, we also started doing what we called flexible payout, where if there was an item that we really wanted, we would give you more of the share. So if you showed us a room and board sofa that we thought was beautiful and that we could sell for, $700, we might give you 80% and just take 20 because we knew that was something we could process quickly on our website. But the other thing I'll say about inventory, one of the challenges of having a used goods marketplace is that the biggest piece of feedback, I mean, even when we had 7,000 items that we would get from users was, you guys don't have enough stuff. We could have had like 1,000 chairs, and you would tell us we didn't have enough chairs. And I think that's because every item is unique. There's only one of every item. So if you as a user are going to like look for a dining table, there's a look that you're going for. And if we don't have it, then you're going to think we don't have enough stuff, which I think is just a unique challenge that used goods do pose.
One more question. How big was your team, founding team?
Founding team?
Yes.
There were 4 of us.
So one of the reasons why a lot of startups fail is when founding team actually fights and then they're not aligned and there are a lot of conflicts.
Yeah.
So did you have such situations? How did you achieve like maximum candor and transparency and honesty? And how did you make sure that you guys are all aligned and on the same page? And how did you also deal with the disagreements?
Totally. So I'll start by saying I think we were incredibly fortunate in that the one thing that the 4 of us never disagreed on was vision. So like we all really believed in what we were doing, and we believed in the path we were taking to get there, and we were going to do whatever it took to make it happen. That said, I started a business with 3 close friends of mine, which I don't know if any of you are working with good friends of yours, but that can sometimes pose a challenge, especially when you have a fun social relationship with somebody, and now you're both basically financially tied together and dependent on each other in this other weird way, and there's a lot of pressure. So I will say that I don't think we always handled conflict well. I think that there were a lot of things that we could have done better. I think one of the things that we probably should have been more intentional about is separating friendship and business, and making sure that there was time for both, because I think we basically stopped the friendship stuff and only talked about the business stuff, and that I think that made all of our jobs more difficult, because I think there's a trust factor there that you start to question. But that said, I really think in terms of navigating conflict, I mean, we really tried to talk through things together and to listen to each other if one of us really disagreed on something. And oftentimes that involved the 4 of us sitting in a conference room and trying to hash out the solution and come up with it. That's really when we were shutting down the business. There was a lot of that, like what is the right path for us and for the 4 of us as individuals and the 4 of us as founders of this company. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think my biggest piece of advice would be to be really thoughtful about who you start a company with and be really aware of what people are good at, what they're not good at. And I don't know, we also had a coach. We had an executive coach. So we had 200 plus employees, and we worked I had my own coach, but we also had a coach that worked with all of us to be able to help us understand how we were perceived by people and where our shortcomings might be, and how that impacted kind of the way decisions were made at the organization level.
Pretty much the same question, but just to add on that, what were your backgrounds, the founding team, and then how is your friendship now? Would you see yourself starting another business with the same founders?
Yeah. So our backgrounds were all a little bit different. We were all the same age, but Bill, who was the CEO, had spent 2 years working at Boston Consulting Group doing strategy consulting. Ryan, who was our CTO, had just recently finished his master's degree in physics engineering and was a consultant for, basically an engineering consultant for a healthcare company, but had a really strong engineering background. And Jenny, who was our chief marketing officer, she had worked in digital marketing at an ad agency in San Francisco. And then there was me, who I did not have supply chain experience, but I had been a teacher and worked in VC, and have always really liked operations and building systems and processes. That's what you do when you're a teacher. You build a lot of systems. And so I got to use some of those skills, but a lot of it for me, there was a big learning curve for me, for sure. And as far as how we are now, I think we're probably better friends now than we were while we were running the company. And I think, I don't know, my theory is that can probably go one of 2 ways. I think if a company shuts down, I've seen situations where founders will no longer speak to each other. I think in my case, I feel closer to all of them than I've ever felt to them, largely because we shut down a business together, and that's a really horrible thing to do. It's not a fun process, and in our case, I think we all came together.
So you mentioned some advice from VCs that you wish you kind of hadn't listened to. Is there one piece of advice from a a particular VC? Obviously, you don't have to name any names, but something that really stood out to you and you thought was really helpful.
This is a very technical thing, but early on, we had a lot of conversations about how to do marketing. And one of our investors talked a lot about having what he called an experimental marketing budget. So setting aside a pool of money for you to try a bunch of random things that you might not otherwise think about. Like it could be, TV ads or whatever it was. And he also told us that we should separate out our supply marketing and our demand marketing. So we should have teams focused on each because it was too hard for people to make the switch back and forth. But I think both of those were really, really solid pieces of advice that we eventually took, and it paid off.
All right, thanks very much.
Cool.
Thank you.
Que la famille.